Hi guys, I hope you're really well. If you're watching this on YouTube and this is useful, please remember to subscribe and click like. If you're watching this on Instagram, please remember to follow and by all means give the video a big fat heart. So, these are common problems with the concept of memory. So first things first, let's talk about the nouns because that's slightly easier to do. So a memory, you need to divide it in French into whether you are talking about the capacity to remember or an individual memory. So I have a lovely memory of walking along the river with somebody wonderful. This is going to be un souvenir, un souvenir. You're going to hear that word again in a moment when we talk about verbs which use memory, but for the moment this is the nouns, un souvenir, un souvenir. If you are talking about the capacity to remember, like he has a good memory, okay, then that would be mémoire, une mémoire, la mémoire, ma mémoire, okay, which is obviously closer to the English word memory. So, like in IT, for example, a memory stick, like une carte mémoire, whatever, carte USB, we often use USB, but like we will use mémoire for that rather un souvenir. Okay, so un souvenir is a memory that you have, an individual memory of doing something, and mémoire is the capacity. Next thing, the most common problem with memory, remember, as a verb, is the difference between se souvenir de, which takes de, and se rappeler, and the debate is whether or not that takes de. So, in other words, when you use to remember something or somebody, je me souviens de plus the person. So, I remember Simon, I remember Phil, I remember Lavigne, je me souviens de Phil, je me souviens de Simon, je me souviens de, whatever, Lavigne. She's a mate I went out with last night. If you are using se souvenir de, please remember that you are always going to need the de and you may need to join it. So I remember the project, je me souviens du projet, I remember the projects, je me souviens des projets. You can quite happily link that to a verb, so je me souviens d'avoir fait quelque chose, I remember, having done something. I'm going to remember to do something, je vais me souvenir de faire quelque chose. That's absolutely fine to use that with de and to go into a verb in the past or a verb you are yet to do. Next problem. If you have se rappeler, most of France, particularly young France, will try and stick a de on. So they'll say things like, I remember my childhood, je me rappelle de mon enfance. And formally, the example is, I remember my childhood, je me souviens de mon enfance. I remember my childhood, je me rappelle mon enfance. Okay? So strictly speaking, you are not supposed to use the de after se rappeler, but to remember. Here are some problems with that. You can formally, and a lot of teachers get this wrong, formally do that with the third person. So I remember him, je me rappelle de lui. I remember them, je me rappelle de. You can do that. Why don't you check the Figaro article which talks about that? That is absolutely 100% correct. It's very common to say, I remember him, je me rappelle de lui. No, it's very common for somebody to say, I remember my childhood, je me rappelle de mon enfance, but it is strictly speaking, although incredibly common, wrong. So if you're doing an exam, I suggest you don't do it. But it's a colloquialism that a lot of France make. So, if your French is good enough to be making mistakes, like French people are making mistakes, then well done you, as long as you formally know the rule. But I always say, and I teach my students, just don't bother, just use se souvenir. So, anything you remember, se souvenir de plus the verb. There is a subtlety of difference between se souvenir and se rappeler. Se souvenir is often like a fondness, a depth of emotion, rather than se rappeler often people will regard as just the basic ass ability to remember something, but there you go. One of the reasons se rappeler de comes to people's mouths, other than the fact that se souvenir has a de, is because you can use se rappeler de with verbs. So for example, I'm going to remember to do it, je vais me rappeler de le faire. I remember having eaten the cake. Je me rappelle d'avoir mangé le gâteau. So you can go from the se rappeler plus a de plus an infinitive, whether that de is going into a straight infinitive or whether that's going into an auxiliary infinitive. That is completely acceptable. You can do that. The next problem is that rappeler doesn't use de when you are reminding somebody of something, but it uses de when you are reminding somebody to do something. So for example, oh, so this could either be, you remind me of your father, tu me rappelles ton père. Yeah, you remind me, you recall to me your father. Tu me rappelles, oh, you look so much like your father. Tu me rappelles ton père. Um, uh, you know, but if you said, can you remind me to go to the shops? Est-ce que tu peux me rappeler de aller au magasin? So when you are reminding somebody to do something, verb, you can use de. I remember my childhood. Je me rappelle mon enfance. I remember every day. I remember to go to the gym, whatever. Tous les jours, chaque jour, je me rappelle d'aller à la salle de sport. You can use the de with that, which is another reason why se rappeler often ends up having a de colloquially. Remember then that rappeler can be, so when you remember, when you remind somebody something, the thing you are reminding them is the direct and they are the indirect. So I'm going to remind him, je vais lui rappeler whatever the thing is, okay? Either de plus a verb or straight into the noun. Whereas, this is the final problem, if you are using rappeler, the same verb conjugated in the same way can also be recall. So for example, I call Luc, j'appelle Luc, direct. I call him, je l'appelle, direct. As opposed to je lui téléphone, je téléphone à Luc. Téléphoner is indirect. So, because in that situation, you are calling back the person. Whereas I remind Luc, je rappelle à Luc. Yeah, so that is the problem as well. That's why people get a little bit stuck with the le and the lui. Okay, so let's just try a few examples. I am going to remember this video using se souvenir de. Je vais me souvenir de cette vidéo. I am going to remember this video using se rappeler. Je vais me rappeler cette vidéo. Okay. While we're there and we're talking about the verb se souvenir, can we just make sure that our twangs are in the right place? I don't like a misplaced twang. So souviens, like bien, is the je form. You might have slight accent variations if you're going into Canada or the south of France, but souviens. And the they form, souviennent, and the subjunctive, souviennent. Yeah, so ya, yen, I keep hearing yon and yan and all kinds of crap. So lovely. So he reminded me to do it. Il m'a rappelé de le faire. He reminded me of, what should we say? He reminded me of his grandfather. Il m'a rappelé son grand-père. There's another verb combination which we can use, which is kind of like, oh, you reminded me of. Either as in, oh, seeing you makes me think of, or you actively recalled to my brain this information, is penser à, faire penser à. So you made me think of, tu m'as fait penser à. Yeah, you made me think of whatever the lesson. Tu m'as fait penser au cours. Yeah. Okay. So that is another thing that we can do as well. So these are some very common problems with rappeler and souvenir and mémoire. Okay, it's a really common fault to use se rappeler de. It really is. It may even be formally accepted into formal French within our lifetime. It's that common. However, and I really stand by that statement. Just like people are using less and less, you know, avant que je ne, with it, you know, the ne expletive. But for the moment, I wouldn't use it in exams if you're doing exams. I'd also just basically encourage the use of se souvenir de to remember and rappeler to remind, and you won't go wrong. All right, guys, if you find this useful, please give a big click, a heart, a like, a follow, a kiss, or whatever. Buy me a coffee. The link will be underneath. All my love. Take care.